Hi, I'm Katie Crane, and this is the Pilates Lounge. Hi everyone, my name is Katie Crane. I'm the Pilates professional. Welcome to episode 32 of the Pilates Lounge Podcast. Today, I am promising you a very interesting conversation about a topic that I can absolutely be certain is going to be relevant to anybody who works in the movement field. This is a topic that is always on our lips as Pilates professionals. It's something that comes up a lot when I'm teaching our student teachers and they're learning all about the body in movement and dynamic posture and dynamic stability. And it's something that we end up dealing with not only in our clients' bodies, but it's something that we have to be really, really mindful of in our own bodies because we actually spend so much time looking down in our own job. So today I have with me the wonderful Michael O'Reilly from Weybridge in the United Kingdom. Michael is a physiotherapist who actually specializes in the management of upper quadrant. So that means that he specializes in the upper back, the neck, shoulder, and head. And he works on conditions in that area of the body. Michael is a regular speaker and educator on this topic, and he applies 20 years of his work in this field, which has taught him so much about the body. In fact, it's taught him so much that he has now developed a product to help people who do have upper quadrant body issues so that they can move with more ease and improve their posture. We're definitely going to get to the OptiNeck balance wedge at some stage, but Michael's welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us. I would love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners and let us know why the upper body.
Hi, Katie. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be on your podcast and to talk a little bit about what I've learned over the years. I think my interest it probably started with an interest in the neck, and then as time went by, expanded out as my understanding grew, expanded to cover the whole upper quadrant. It started with my first job after graduating, which was with a physio who had been trained by Jeff Maitland. And anybody from the physio world of my generation will know that he was one of the founding fathers of manual therapy, which unfortunately seems to have gone a little bit out of vogue at the moment. But there's definitely a case of the baby being thrown out with the bathwater here. But anyway, I was fortunate enough to have some really high quality manual handling and manual therapy inputs from this physio. And the thing that just really ignited my interest in it is to see how much real change can be brought about in a really short space of time. And so it was sort of started with headaches, I guess, was the first sort of port of call, and then moving on to other areas of neck pain. And I think another key moment in my journey was when I then, because I trained in South Africa and then moved to the UK, and I was locuming in the NHS, and I had this old Irish patient who came in, and he had a year's worth of shoulder pain and a year of not being able to get his hand behind his back at all. And I distinctly remember him saying is that if you pinned a 20-pound note to the middle of his back, there is no way he would get it. It would have to stay there. So I thought, and now he'd had MRIs, he'd had previous physio, and this physio referral was because he had a shoulder arthroscopy, which had not found anything. So he'd been sent post that. And I just had this, and he was also talking about, I think it may have been something like a bit of pins and needles or a bit of numbness or something along those lines. Nothing that was too glaring, but I just thought, well, let's just have a feel of his neck. And so I had a feel of his C5 and 6, which was really rather jammed. And so I got in and loosened up that C5, 6. And for the first time in a year, he went from not having no hand behind back at all to full hand behind back in one session, probably within 5 minutes. And that blew me away because I just thought, my word, like how influential and how critical is the neck to the shoulder and the arm. And then as time's gone by, we're seeing more and more patients. I was then seeing that actually in the end, the neck is the victim. Yeah, the neck pain and neck-related problems are seldom neck problems. They're actually trunk imbalance problems because the neck is a compensator. And it's all about what we, from a trunk movement point of view, are the demand that we then place on the neck, and the neck's ability to cope with that is the key thing to understand in managing these problems. And so it's developed from there to seeing patients. As I say, there was a particular neurologist who sent me most of his headache patients, so I learned a lot from that. And then then we see more and more neck pain, and then from there it's sort of branched out into the more sort of chronic shoulder problems. And what that then taught me really is that the neck and the shoulder are two sides of the same coin. And that's if you have a neck issue, you're very, very likely to have a shoulder mechanics issue, even if it isn't a pain presentation or something like that, a distinct thing in itself. There are going to be shoulder issues. And equally, if you've got a shoulder impingement, you are almost certainly going to be having a cervical component to it. And the reason for this is that these are, where I see it, is that the neck and the shoulder are two kind of sub-assemblies that are sitting on top of the foundation of the trunk, which of course then you can take all the way down to the feet. But to keep it simple, it is about seeing these two interrelated sub-assemblies that are all part of the wider machine of the upper quadrant. So it's really, you can't look at the neck in isolation, you can't look at the shoulder in isolation. It's all one big functional unit. And it's an understanding how imbalances in one part of that problem, in one part of that unit, are going to impact others, and not getting too caught up in one particular area, but having that global view. So yeah, that's kind of the journey as to how I got to where I am now from a clinical interest point of view.
Ah, that's interesting. And it's interesting that you say that. You know, I definitely feel like along the journey of, say, a Pilates practitioner, you know, because this is our audience, you know, when we first learn our Pilates, it's almost like we have this broad view of, you know, of the body, of what it is that we're doing, and we're doing all these different things. And along the way, you know, a lot of us become very tunnel visioned, you know, like, you know, this is what the neck is doing, or this is what the shoulder is doing, this is what the pelvis, and quite often we can get fixated on these one areas of the body, or somebody comes in with an issue in the body and that's all we're looking at. But, you know, I'm so happy that you say, you know, with your experience, that, you know, like the way that I understand the body now is it's almost like you've got to zoom in to learn all these intricacies about the body, but then you've got to zoom back out and utilize all of those intricacies and bring them together, you know, for the body to really function well. Is that what you see as well then?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, that's the thing. Like you can, as I say, I was really fortunate to be able to learn and actually one of your countrymen, Dean Watson, who he presents some fantastic neck-headache courses, and has developed a really good system for optimizing the mobilization or the function of the upper cervical spine. So you can get really super specific on those levels, but actually if you haven't identified that there's a sagittal plane blockade through the thoracolumbar junction, you are forever going to be overloading those levels. So you need to have the combination of the specific and the big. And I think you put it really well, where it's a process of zooming in, zooming out, zooming back in, zooming out, but you know, not ever getting to the point where you're missing the wood for the trees. Because that's actually where I cut my teeth a great deal was, and this is with the chronic shoulder pain or complex shoulder pain problems, is that patients had course of physio for what presented as a shoulder impingement or something like that. So that didn't really get better. They went to the consultants. They had an arthroscopic subacromial decompression, which is obviously going out of vogue now as well for good reason. And then they would go back to the consultant, and 6 months later, they've still got the same pain, if not worse. And that's because nobody had ever taken a step back and said, well, you may have a bit of an impingement going on, but you've got the impingement because you've got a fundamental underlying chronic trunk imbalance, which is then has been feeding into a neurodynamic or a compensatory overload of the lower cervical spine, which is then causing shortening and tightening of the anterior scalenes, elevation of the first rib, loss of neural compliance, altering in shoulder mechanics, which is then causing this kind of a secondary impingement. So it was then being able to sort of take that step back and say, well, they may have this there, but they've also got this there and this there. And how does that all fit into one big picture? And how do we then, pardon the pun, but what's the trunk of the problem? What's the root and the trunk of the problems that's leading to the complexity of the branches? Because this is the thing, when I think about these things now, when I lecture on these things, I use the analogy of a tree, and that we've got the roots, we've got the trunk, and we've got the branches. And patients are walking into, or clients are walking into our studios and treatment rooms with the fruit of the tree. So they're walking in with neck pain, or they're walking in with headaches, or they're walking in with upper thoracic pain. And so we look at the fruit and we try and dissect the fruit and all the rest of it. But what we've got to understand is that all of that is the result of a longer run process, which starts at the roots. And the roots are how are we spending our day? What's the balance of biomechanical input that is going into our day, which then feeds up into the trunk, and i.e. the trunk. And then from there, we then start branching out in all to these different manifestations and into what can seem like an awful lot of complexity. And so we've got to be able to come back and say, okay, what are all these things that just seem so crowded and clouded? What's all that sitting on top of? And how can we influence the thing that it's sitting on top of? And then taking another step to say, how can we change the inputs into the system, i.e., what are the habits? What are the movements? How are we spending our day? That's putting credits into the dysfunctional bank or the imbalanced bank, And this is one of I'm sure you've come across Atomic Habits by James Clear, but he puts this so well when he says that, we're always casting votes. Every day we're casting votes, and so and eventually, all those votes are counted up, and then you end up with a result. And I think this is so applicable to movement, in that every day we're casting votes for balanced, sustainable movement, or are we casting votes for imbalanced movement? And it's just one vote. And so you may not reap the reward of that sustainable or unsustainable movement today or tomorrow or the next day. But by the time you've cast enough votes, you are going to get that outcome and that result. So the challenge is in managing these situations to be able to, exactly as you say, go from the minutiae to the big, back to the minutiae, influence those key things, but most importantly is empower clients and patients with the tools and abilities to be able to give the right input and the right corrections on a daily basis so that they can then chart a course of sustainable movement. So, sorry, it's a long-winded answer.
No, that's good. I love that book, Atomic Habits. And he's cool. I almost think of it also, it's like compound interest, it's like, and everything is accumulative in the body. It's not like you didn't wake up with this frozen shoulder. That didn't happen overnight, and I've said it to other people that I've, had conversations with on the podcast. Well, I'm pretty sure the body was probably trying to tell you something for a long time before something got so chronic that you're not able to take that $20 bill from the middle of your back. We're not very good at listening to those cues because we're busy. I mean, and maybe we're not even taught. We're so unattached to the body these days. I'm just finished reading a book by a psychologist called Ian McGilchrist. He's from your neck of the woods. He's English. And he talks about the left and right brain. And he also talks about this, zooming in is very left brain, very mechanical, wanting to get, down to the nitty gritty, really focusing on one thing. But sometimes we end up focusing on the one things to our own detriment, and it's that whole stepping back would also be, taking a moment to listen to the whispers of your body and being aware of the way that you are moving all the time or how you're not moving. And I definitely feel like that's our job as, movement educators or manual practitioners to teach people to be part of their body, to be part of their experience in their environment and not just be so mechanical all day long, you know.
Yeah.
But I was going to ask something. Oh, I forget what it was because I went on my little tangent. But could you tell us like a little bit about on your website you refer to, you know, like the information age postural pandemic or the postural pandemic or the prevailing wind of the digital age. Do you think that this technological age is playing a big effect on our posture?
Absolutely. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that this is a huge issue. But it's interesting that you say is that we don't listen to the whispers. And one of those whispers at the moment is just that the background neck stiffness and upper back stiffness that people have just come to accept, well, that's just normal. And it's really interesting to me is to try and understand what it is, you know, at what point does something that's a background annoyance start cause you to take action? Let's put it that way, you know, because when the patients that I see, they'll say, well, they've had this background neck stiffness for years. And then it's only when that stiffness progresses even from being a dull ache to then a sharp pain. And then it really starts interrupting their day that they then take action. But the thing is that the whispers are telling you the system's not operating in a sustainable way, you know, and we've got to bring attention to that because in a way the body is, our spines and our skeletons are just amazingly made. And the neck has such a high compensatory capacity, which is fantastic because it allows us to move really well. But actually that becomes a problem in the longer term because it can absorb so much imbalanced, unsustainable movement. And it just keeps absorbing until one day it can no longer absorb. And that's when we sort of cross that threshold and symptoms then start becoming big interrupters in our day, and then we seek help, etc. But the problem is that there's been a lot of wear, a lot of strain, a lot of stress concentration, and then also a lot of wear and tear that's been happening in the background at that level of, oh, it's just an ache, it's just stiffness, it's etc. So it's almost like by the time we get to the red light, we've been living with the amber light for too long. And there's a price to be paid for that, you know. And so my mission is to try and get people to understand that, like, you've got to heed these, you've got to listen to what your body is saying, you know. And that doesn't mean you need to, you know, going to a physio, going to a chiro, going to an osteopath, going to whatever, but you need to listen. It's not normal to have aches and pains as anyone who's under the age of 50, 60, etc. But there's people who's living with it from their 20s and onwards. So, but coming back to the question about what was called information age syndrome, because when I first started talking about it, that's what we were referring to this as, the information age, which is probably about 15 years ago. And because I could already see then that you know, so much neck pain, so much shoulder pain, so much cervicogenic headaches, cervicogenic dizziness was all being driven by the fact that we are getting increasingly addicted to our screens. And yeah, I started talking about this probably even before the advent of the iPhone. And now that we have the iPhone, we've just seen this massive explosion or an implosion of our movement, in that we've become so much more static. I mean, I was doing a bit of research the other day, and we all, on average, we spend 3 to 4 hours a day on our phones alone. So never mind our other screens that we're in front of, never mind our static postures while we're driving, never mind our static postures while we're sitting on the sofas. We've got 3 to 4 hours a day on our phones in an imbalanced position, where the center of mass of the head is forwards of its base of support. You know, and the structural engineers and mechanical engineers will tell you that is not a sustainable state of affairs. You know? So yeah, I've just seen that over this time, and it's been interesting to observe, because our children are sort of mid-teenagers now, and so we've observed them, and we've observed their friends and people who play in their sports teams and the children at school, etc. And I'm just seeing this really significant postural imbalance, this postural degradation that's going on, and that there are these children who are walking around with postures that we wouldn't expect to see in anyone other than a 45-year-old office worker, where they're already kyphotic, where they're already really forwards, head shifted. And that's because they've grown up in front of screens. And just it's common sense from a mechanical point of view, is that if their spines are growing into these positions where they are already forwards loaded, that's going to cause a huge amount of problems in the years to come. So we look at, I'm sure it's the same in Australia, but in the UK, the road sign for OAPs is two people who are bent forwards. So, that, and we know they're OAPs because they bend forwards, right? So that's synonymous with that generation. But now the current OAPs didn't grow up in front of screens. Not many of them spent their entire lives working in front of screens. So my prediction and my real concern is that this is going to be a massive problem for us, not only in terms of the aches and pains and all the rest of it that it's going to be causing, but also in terms of mobility, in terms of morbidity, and all the implications that has for healthcare and health demands on society over the coming decades. So we need to be getting that education out to people now, that the votes that you cast today, and the seeds that, or in my metaphor, the seeds that you sow today, you will reap a reward and you will reap a harvest of that. And so you need to be really mindful of are those seeds that you're sowing and what are you watering every day. So yes, and so now, in order to sort of simplify the image around it, I talk about the prevailing wind of the information age, and that being, like a windswept tree on a hillside that gets bent over at 90 degrees, like in the West Country here, as the wind comes in off the Atlantic. We are in that position where we're spending all that time forwards. We are going to end up forwards, and the kind of milestones along that journey is going to be neck pain, and it's going to be cervicogenic headache, and it's going to be shoulder impingements, and it's going to be radiculopathies and all these sorts of things. And so, I feel this like burning desire to shout it from the rooftops to say, don't sleepwalk into this problem because it's going to be there. And what's I think has actually been so distracting is that there's been a few research articles that have come out that I think have been massively misinterpreted, in saying that there's no correlation between posture and pain. And where I saw you roll your eyes there, Casey. But there's sectors of the rehab and movement world that have sort of picked up on this and said, oh, okay, that's fine. No, we don't need to tell patients that it's important how you move. We don't need to tell patients that it's important how you spend your day. And so we've been able to just say, okay, well, we'll chuck that out and we'll forget about that. And we'll say, just sleep better and get less stressed. Like, okay, well, that's fine. But physics is physics. And physics will remain physics. Mechanics will remain physics. So anyway, don't get me started. I don't know what your view is on that.
No, don't get me started, my friend. I hear you. Well, I see what you see as well. I've also got a teenage boy, and I see his friends walk in, and they're literally, they pretty much are never off their phone. Like we're super strict in the house that we live in. We put them in the drawer, we don't use them, and we live on property. So, so we're lucky, we're out in the garden, we're having to do stuff outside all the time, but a lot of the city kids are not doing it. And I see that, in my son's friends. Even out on the footy field, my son plays rugby, and just seeing, a lot of those kids just look so wound up that then they struggle to take long strides. It takes away their dynamic capability to do anything, I think. Yeah. And not only, neck and shoulders, headaches. I'm thinking, so if I've got the poor posture from the upper body, then my diaphragm is impeded. I'm not able to breathe properly. My gut is getting squashed. I'm not able to digest food properly. My pelvic floor, which is connected to the roof of my mouth, is now not able to go into this deep connection anymore. So, I think that we end up seeing, women with potentially, kind of lower tone, shorter pelvic floor strength as well, instead of this depth of tone, because we're not able to breathe well as well. I think that, the knockoff effect is much bigger than what a lot of people anticipate. And I have heard the argument of, it's not the technological age. When my grandma was growing up, she was knitting or, reading or stuff like this. But it's not just the activity of looking down. It's what you say is the staticness of what is happening. And it's for these long periods of time. You know, when my grandma, when I was growing up with my grandma, she was knitting as well, but she was also out in the garden for 4 hours, you know, tending, you know, putting her clothes up on a washing line. You know, she was naturally, incidentally, so much more active than what people are today. So in my mind, that argument is completely moot, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it in much younger generations, hands down.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this is the important thing, you know, is that, and again, it comes back to James Clear and habits. And, you know, what we need to understand is that the big tech is invested in having us habituated. You know, we are, without getting too big conspiracy theory on this, we are being manipulated into creating the habit of screen addiction, because it's all about keeping our eyeballs. So everything on our phone is, and everything that's being put out there is essentially a form of manipulation of us in order to keep us connected, keep us engaged, keep us buying stuff, you know, keep us looking at it, at advertising. And so we need to really be aware of this. You know, it's not just by chance. You know, this is by design. And you know, I've had just yesterday, actually, I had 2 patients who both came in with problems which are fundamentally driven by the amount of screen time that they have in a day. And because I know this is a big habit thing, because in my book, you know, it is a bad habit for all the time that we spend, and I think probably most of us would agree with that. And that habit change takes time. So I said to them, okay, just start off, just make yourself the little rule that you're not going to look at a video on your phone. Okay, because yes, we need to be on our phones for communication, for organizing children's lives, for banking, for whatever. But so, you know, we can't just say, well, chuck the phones in the river. We've got to say, so I said to them, okay, look, just start off by saying you're not going to watch any videos on your phone, right? So you don't, if you want to watch something on TV, watch it on a big screen, because I would rather you were sitting in an aligned, supported position, looking at something further in the distance with the weight of your head carried by something else, just to unload your neck, etc. And so if you really want to do that, do it like that. Don't do it on your screen, on your mobile phone. Yeah. And so just take that little step, and then from there we're going to work on another little step of saying, okay, all the while trying to free ourselves from the bondage of our devices, you know, because it's not only and I think we're obviously getting a better understanding of what are the psychological, emotional impacts of our screen addiction. But what we need now is much more of an understanding of what the physical and the biomechanical impact of our screen addictions are. So,
well, you've got a lifetime task ahead of you. I was reading an article by a really well-known marketer called Ryan Levesque. And he, in the article that I was reading, he had done a study on, because he does marketing, you know, so, you know, is it on handheld devices or on people's big screen? And in the last 3 years, people are now using their handheld devices for all of their shopping, you know, for all of their tasks, 70% compared to, it was 40% just 3 years ago. It's been a huge jump. You know, from a marketing standpoint, you know, if you're out there trying to market your studio, then make sure you've got, you know, everything is optimized for phones. But, you know, but from a postural standpoint, yeah, it's a very, very difficult task, because like you say, you know, it's a consumer world. You know, of course, you know, every company in the world wants our eyeballs on that screen. And not only, I mean, you know, I think it's one thing. We need to educate people about the postural issues that are going to come with, you know, excessive use of these devices. But it's a hard task, because dopamine is constantly taking us back to the phone, you know, without realizing it. We're getting a hit every time we open that screen. You know, it's a feel-good mechanism. So I wonder, is it educating people not only about the biomechanics of what's going on, but also those types of things? Okay, so the only way you can get past that dopamine hit that you're looking for is to find something else that is going to give you that feeling, which could be very difficult. But, you know, it might be something, you know, like doing 5-star jumps or something, you know, giving people an activity to do instead of getting on the phone, which is a very, very hard task to get people to do. But I think that will be part of that switch in the brain as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. But it's, this is the thing that I've then seen, obviously, is the power of habits, etc. And that was one of the key things that I saw is the value of the balance wedge that I've then created. And that it's, that habit loop is cue, routine, reward. If we can have a regular cue or an ever-present cue, a simple routine and a tangible reward, we form a habit loop. And so, as you say, that's the dopamine hits is the reward in that, and that's why our phones, we just need to look at them to get them to open up, because they want to make the routine as simple as possible. But I then was thinking, well, if we can leverage this in a positive way, as in the habit loop in a positive way, then we can really help to influence habits. And if we can change input, we can change output. And so this is the thing that I then inadvertently discovered is one of the biggest values of the balance wedge, in that it's about making effective exercise easy. And by putting patients into the position that the balance wedge allows you to get into, which is essentially about rebalancing trunk mechanics in such a way that it's quick, easy, and effective, it then, after 10 minutes, just a 10-minute routine on the wedge, you can then stand up and you can feel completely different. And this is the thing, and that there's a very short stop between your cue and your reward. And if we can bring those two closer and closer together, we then set up a positive habit loop. And so what we see with patients is that patients and other users is that they feel so profoundly different from a trunk balance point of view after 10 or 15 minutes on the wedge, that we give them a different experience of movement, a different experience of body balance. And that is like a revelation to them. And what they then want, it's like they now feel what it's like to be balanced, feel what it's like to have a floaty trunk, you feel what it's like to have your center of mass move backwards as we free up all the things that are pulling us forwards. That then creates that like, I want that again. That, and I don't know if dopamine is involved in that hit or not, but it creates an experience that now patients and users understand the difference between where we are, which has become increasingly flexed, increasingly stuck, which is then normal for us. We don't even question that because it is normal. So then going to, no, but this is what freer movement feels like. This is what it's like to be able to lift your arms without any effort. This is what it's like to feel taller, feel lighter. And so that's like that sort of light bulb that goes on, which then means now you can experience, you understand the difference between how you feel once you've been in front of the screen for 3 hours and how you could feel. And that's then the thing that then creates that positive habit loop. And we see that it's actually being borne out, in that when we do a study on those who've been using the wedge for more than 6 months, because this is the key thing that I was really interested in, is that can we bring about longer term change by implementing habit? And when we looked at 170 people and we then said, okay, how many times are you still using the wedge? And so for those who are using it for more than 6 months, I forget the figures exactly, it's something like 80% are still using it 3 to 4 times a week. And what that really then says to me is that they formed a habit, and they've only formed a habit because it's as easy to do. There's a regular cue, it's easy to do, and they feel the difference. So therefore they want to do it. And this is the key thing. And this is like one of the USPs of it but it's about what we need to be achieving, is that the prevailing wind is pushing us all into flexion all the time. And we can't change that, because like you say, most of the admin of our lives is now on our phone, never mind our entertainment. So we can't, it's not realistic to say, well, just turn your phone off and go and get a Nokia 3110. They're here to stay. But now it's saying, okay, let's try and minimize what we do on it, but also let's make sure we're putting in the mitigations, so we can balance those scales of movement to say the static side is going to be weighing down. That's here to stay. So let's try and take as much out of that as we possibly can. But then let's make sure we adding weight to the mobile side so that we can chart that even steady course. So it is all about creating corrective habits. But to create the corrective habits, it has to be ever present. It has to be easy and it has to be immediately rewarding. Otherwise, yeah, because another thing I talk about is I've got this graphic where I've got 3 pillars, basically. There's the first pillar is your motivation to exercise. The second pillar is the complexity of the routine and the complexity of the exercise. And the third pillar is the reward. So in the early stages of your aches and pains or whatever your presenting condition is, your motivation is going to be high. So, I picture someone standing on the top of their motivation bar, looking across the complexity of the exercise and seeing the reward. So as long as they can see the reward, because their motivation is high enough, they're then going to go through the routine, do the exercise, and get the benefits. But the problem is that when we start feeling better, so the motivation is less and the pain is therefore less, that building or that pillar drops off a little bit. And then if you're standing on the top of that pillar, you can't see the reward past the complexity of the exercise. And then the routine doesn't happen, and because you're no longer then getting the reward, and then the change falls down, the change stops, the habit hasn't been formed. So if we can create exercises and routines and other sort of tools for patients where we can lower the complexity of the exercise and lower the middle pillar and increase the reward pillar, then almost no matter where you are on the motivation pillar, you're going to be able to see the reward and therefore complete the routine or complete the exercise or the activity or whatever it is. And therefore we can then set up that positive habit loop. So because it's all about the little things we're doing every day. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. It's everything we do in Pilates. Could you, hang on, my desk is going up. Could you explain to our listeners what the optic neck balance wedge looks like a little bit? Because I've seen it online, and it's definitely, it's in a shape that we're all super familiar with. So could you explain to our listeners, what does it kind of look like? Why did you decide on that design, and just what are some basic types of movements that you're getting people to do on it that are so beneficial?
Okay. So this is going to be a little bit of a long answer to a short question.
Good.
So essentially, the fundamental drivers of upper quadrant dysfunction are what I refer to as ratchets and wedges. If you take a filing cabinet and you tilt that filing cabinet forwards, the first thing that happens is the top drawer slides out, right? So that's effectively tilt the trunk forwards and the head goes forwards, right? You can't, in the physio world, there's been so much emphasis on just, closing the drawer, but quite obviously, if the filing cabinet remains forwards, you can close the drawer, but as soon as you take your hand away, the drawer is going to go back out again because it's a mechanical inevitability. So we should be in the position where our filing cabinet is just rocking forwards and backwards throughout the day in a nice, pendular, sustainable way. And the drawer is going out and back, but it's never anywhere for too long. And most importantly, the center of mass of it spends most of its day over the base of support of the trunk, pelvis, and feet if you're standing, etc. So we should be like that, but unfortunately, because the prevailing wind of the information age, we spend all the time with the trunk, with the filing cabinet forwards, and therefore the drawer out, and therefore you overloading the hinges, the neck, the shoulder, etc., etc. So now, because we spend so much time in that position, we then start stiffening into that position, and so it's effectively like you then slide a wedge underneath the back of the filing cabinet, so it can't come all the way back. Right. So now we've got this restriction to trunk extension and thoracic extension, and that's effectively the stiffening through the mid-thoracic spine, rib cage, etc., etc. And so we've got this posterior articular barrier, so figuratively the wedge underneath the filing cabinet, and then anteriorly we've got this progressive shortening and tightening down of the pectoral and other anterior trunk myofascia. So that's what I refer to as the ratchets. So it's this slow, steady process of shortening, tightening down through the front, and a slow, steady process of the wedge creeping its way in further and further to the back, all the while preventing the filing cabinet from rocking back up and right. So then we get into a situation where we're now stuck forwards, and then we're constantly causing that loading of sensitive structures in the neck and the shoulder, which then leads to the irritation, pain, sensitization, etc., etc. So what we need to do, what I've learned over the years, is that the fundamental correction that we need then is to remove the wedges and release the ratchets, i.e. we need to restore thoracic and trunk extension and overall thoracic compliance to the rib cage, etc., etc. And then we need to release the ratchets, so that shortening and tightening of the anterior myofascial chains that's pulling us all into flexion all the time. So and if we can then bring us back to that balance point, we then are in a sustainable biomechanical position, and therefore minimal wear and tear. Happy days. So all the while, then I've been working on that, and I developed what is called the OptiNeck program, which is all about trying to improve that thoracic extension, or trying to help patients to improve and maintain thoracic extension and anterior chain compliance. But I just saw that there was still something missing. And that is that because the prevailing wind is so strong and we're spending so much time in that position, is that we need an external force or external input to maintain the compliance of the fascia and mobility of the skeleton, trunk, etc. So it's actually something that I then stumbled across during lockdown when I was doing a video call with a patient. And she had a typical neck shoulder complex issue thing going on. And she had a full length foam roller at home. And I thought, okay, well, let's see what we can do with this. So she put her camera down at floor level, and then she clambered on, as you do, onto the full length foam roller. And now was the reasonably athletic patient, but it still struck me as the why we don't use foam rollers as much as we could do and should do. And that's because they're a pain in the ass. There's some benefits to them. And for your high level patients, they can be a good challenge. But for the majority of your patients and clients, they're actually just too awkward. And that awkwardness creates a barrier to exercise. And so because the camera was down at that level, I thought, I wonder if we can change a few things here, and if we can just make this easier to use, because we want to restore that trunk extension. So if we can change our orientation to gravity and get gravity working for us rather than against us, we can set about restoring that mid-thoracic and thoracolumbar extension. And actually now, from a Pilates application point of view, it's being used for whole spine, which is obvious, and my narrow mind at the time didn't see that. But and then because we're then putting patients into a position where we are freeing up the scapulae and we creating a degree of elevation, we can then get all of this arm opening, like window series and all the rest of it, and windmill, and depending on your Pilates terminology, but you know what I mean. And we can get all this going to free up that trunk and rebalance that trunk and unload the neck and unload the shoulders. So I thought, okay, well, let's see if you can do something about that. So I bought home a whole bunch of foam rollers, and I started chopping them up into different shapes and sizes and profiles and all sorts of different things. And then eventually ended up with what is now the OptiNeck balance wedge, which is, if you picture a foam roller and I'm always reluctant to say this because people say, you can do that on a foam roller. I'm like, well, yes, you can, but actually this isn't a foam roller and it is completely different. And because it kind of shares an origin with the foam roller, but it is completely different. And because it's completely different, it opens up a whole new world of opportunities. But anyway, so it's essentially, balance wedge is, as it says, it's a wedge. It's a whole spine and head length wedge. So from sacrum, or depending on how tall you are, from coccyx to head support. And so it's a wedge, but it has a convex upper profile, which then means you are center load bearing in the same way that you would be on a foam roller, but you're center load bearing along the whole length of the spine. But so you're supporting the head, and you are then tending to load up. If you're particularly kyphotic and stiff, then you're going to tend to be load bearing more through the mid thoracic spine. But that's what we want, because we want to be able to restore extension through that. And but it's importantly, it's got a flat base. So what it does is and if you wanted to have a look at it, for those out there, optineck.com. So, but what it does is it gives you a great combination of mobility and support. So mobility where you want it, support where you want it. And it's the really important thing is it makes it so much easier to use, because it's, coming back to a foam roller, you've got to clamber on it. And the only way to get off of it after you've loaded up your coccyx and sacrum trying to get up and down off of it, the only way to get off of it is to fall off of it and try and do that gracefully. So it's all about, it makes it easier to use. And if it's easier to use, it forms a habit. And if it's easier to use, then you spend more time on it. And if you spend more time on it, you bring about more change. And so, but what I'm seeing now and what I'm super excited about is that more and more people in the Pilates world are getting a hold of it. And they're like, wow, well, you can do this with it. You can do that with it. You can do the next thing. And I'm like, fantastic. Go for it. And so yeah, it's as others have said, the genius of it is in its simplicity. And I feel privileged to have had the epiphany drop into my head, but now I feel a real burden of responsibility to take this message out to the world, because this is one of the key things that I fundamentally truly believe can help us be more upright, mobile 80-year-olds than we would otherwise have been.
And do you think is part of it? Like when we use foam rollers a lot in the studio because that's all we've got. I haven't got my OptiNeck yet, but I'm definitely going to get them, because even when I look at it, so many ideas come to mind. And, so we use a foam roller quite often. It is somebody, with kyphotic posture. So then I've got cushions underneath their head, but then the cushion isn't quite the right height, and it's not allowing for that, for gravity to help with a natural posture. It's just continuing to push the head forwards is the problem with the cushion. So then I've got wedge cushions and I've tried all sorts of things. But the OptiNeck balance wedge is basically, like you said, it's a foam roller that's been tapered down, so then it allows for that upper body support, isn't it? But then but it takes away the balance challenge as well. Yeah. So you could put it, for our listeners, you could put it on your reformer, do your footwork, do your supine arms, feet in straps. You could do all of the stuff that you want to do with clients on the roller, on the reformer, but you've taken away that really uncomfortable getting on and off, and sometimes dangerous getting on and off of the machine, and they've got all of the support that they need. And same with the trap table. I mean, I can see that there's so many applications in our industry, so I'm sure there's going to be plenty of applications in so many other industries as well. I think that it's fantastic. But do you think that that's part of the benefits of it, is that because you're supine, you're laying on your back, your relationship to gravity now has changed from that bipedal position, so you no longer have that pull of gravity pulling you down to your grave? You can actually allow for everything, allow for the tissue to unwind, allow for that openness, that then people get off of the balance wedge and they feel that sense of relief, or that sense of height. Even on a roller, people will often get off and they say, oh, it's not that I feel taller, I almost feel lighter, because of that relationship.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And in what I've seen and what I really believe creates that feeling is that we are subtly releasing the ratchets, removing the wedges, which then means we've gone from that we no longer even think about that, having to support ourselves in that forwards bent, forwards tilted position, where because the important thing is to understand the torque moments, as in like the twisting forces that occur around the trunk and around the neck as a result of that big heavy weight of our head being forwards of its base of support. There's an awful lot of energy and effort that goes into having to keep it there, but we don't think about that because it's normal. But if you look at a baby that's just learned to sit, how do they sit? Completely, beautifully. Once they've got that head control, they sit completely beautifully upright, because they don't have the strength to be able to support the weight of their head in any other position. So it's like we learn how to sit in a biomechanically effective way, or to be upright in a biomechanically effective way, or biomechanically efficient way. But then as we get stronger, we can live with the inefficiencies. So then we get used to the head being further and further forwards. And the important thing to remember is that the head is 8% of body mass. The shoulder girdle is 10% of body mass. So you've got 2 times 10 plus 8, 28% of your body mass, which is high up in the structure of our bodies. Now, if that's got any tendency that there is for that to be either pulled or pushed forwards, is going to have a profound effect on our overall ability to move and our overall body balance. So by spending the 10, 15 minutes either on the foam roller or on the wedge, what you're doing is releasing that anterior chain if you're working on an arm opening series, etc. And by being in the position of then just deep breathing, the simple act of deep breathing and the articulation that brings through the costovertebral joints and then in turn through the thoracic spine to restore that extension using the ground reaction force coming up through the wedge into the spine to restore that extension, then just means we've taken away these two big forces that are subtly but profoundly pulling us forwards. So we release that, and now we're free to like, oh, wow, now instead of, because in my treatment room, I've got a bowling ball that sits on top of this hinge. And because I used to just get the patient to hold on to a bowling ball and say, and I wouldn't tell them why, but I'd just say, hold on to this for a couple of minutes while I ask you a few more questions. And then they'd be like, oh, okay, I don't know why I'm doing that. And then I get to the point of saying, well, that's what your head weighs. And think about where that is going to be, because you carry that around all day long. And then I took it a step further to mount the bowling ball on this hinge, which is roughly proportioned to the thoracolumbar junction, the cervicothoracic junction, and then the head rocking through. And I've got a little handle lever on there, and I get them to feel the difference in load, in twisting force that there is when that bowling ball is on top of its base of support and when it's in front of its base of support. And that's another one of these real light bulb moments of, oh my goodness, I had no understanding, I had no idea about that. But if we can then, when we release those things and the head is able to float back and the shoulder girdle is able to come back into the position where it should be, spending most of its time around the trunk, we are going to feel lighter. And, and I've had numerous patients who have come in and they say, I'm 2 centimeters taller. And that's because we've just taken that spine and we've got them, we've created the input whereby they are regularly correcting, regularly removing the wedges, releasing the ratchets, and they are able to restore back up to what is actually their height. So they've just lost height because of their movement and postural inefficiencies. But just one more thing on this is that what I've seen is that I've really had to reset my expectation and understanding of how much potential there is for improvement in spines in the 50s, 60s, 70-year-olds, where before it was like, well, that's a stiff, stuck spine. There's nothing you're going to be able to do about it. What I've learned and what I'm seeing with the wedge is that if you just give the right input regularly enough, you can actually restore so much more movement than I ever, in previous 20 years, ever believed it was possible. It's all about habit.
That's so good. Oh, yeah, I've seen amazing things in the studio. I currently work with a lady. She's 76 years old. She's been with me for 9 years, and she's gone from being osteoporotic to having osteopenia. She literally used to walk in looking at her feet, and now she can stand with her whole back up against the wall straight. Once a week. Well, now she comes twice a week, but once a week, and it was just once a week, and then giving her concepts to consider in her everyday life.
Yeah.
So the change is, like every vote does count. The change is accumulative. It is compound interest. That if you are consistent, it doesn't have to be, an hour every day of doing something, but it does have to be this consistent mindfulness of the way that we're moving and the small changes and just moving in general. But what do you find when you're working in general? And I know that this, this is like it's throwing a stone into a pond, but in general, if you're working with somebody with, a postural issue, what types of changes are you seeing and how long are you recommending people be doing their homework in general?
So in terms of how long to be doing it, it's about making it undaunting and attainable. So I'm looking to say to patients, well, if you can spend 10 to 15 minutes on the wedge a day, that's great. Just make it as easy as possible. And what we're seeing in terms of those changes, I talk about having a full house of knuckles. And what I mean by that is if you're looking front on to a patient, as we get all imbalanced, we end up with our thumbs. If you just look at the hands, how they're hanging, most people will be in a situation where their thumbs are facing inwards, and you can see all of the back of their hands. And that's because of that keyboard, phone posture, etc. So they'll be walking in with that full house of knuckles. And what we're obviously aiming for is to get to the point where the thumbs are facing back forwards again, and you're seeing maybe 2 knuckles squeaking around the corner kind of thing. So we see that as a big change. Just overall, I'm looking at the patient side on, just doing that quick visual assessment of where is the central mass of the head, so mastoid process down, where is that sitting in relation to the feet. That's a big change that we're seeing. And then even just the simple, what I refer to as the quick test for the upper quadrant is just a double arm lift. Is just to see how freely and easily and enthusiastically do they do that? How well is that movement distributed? So what's the range? How much thoracic associated extension do you get with that? And just what's their general experience of it? You just pick all of that up just by looking at them, looking at their face, looking at and obviously the specifics of shoulder movements, etc. So yeah, they're just really simple things. And I also point that out to them. I say, well, always be having a look at how many knuckles you've got, because that's going to be your own sort of self-management, your own barometer. So you're going to be at your screen for 7 hours a day, spreadsheet bashing. You're going to have a full house of knuckles. But what I want is that after a 10 to 15 minute wedge session, you can stand back up again, you're back to thumbs facing forwards, and you can do a nice free and easy double arm lift. Keep it simple, keep it simple, keep it simple. So, and empowering them with their understanding. This is a key thing. This is why I bang the drum of the ratchets and wedges concept and the prevailing wind, because it's about making these concepts as simple as possible. So the simpler they are, the more attainable they are, the more they're going to hit home, the more you're going to bring about change.
And the beautiful thing is, like when you work with people, is seeing that change, but recognizing that change can happen at any stage of life. There's no stage of somebody's life that the tissue isn't pliable, that the tissue is no longer able to change. I think that, that's whenever I work with, elderly people or people who have been in these chronic conditions for a long time. And a lot of the time they come to us and they actually don't believe that change is possible. Or they, I'm sure that you see people, like they never come to you when they're feeling good. They come to you when they've tried everything that they can think of trying themselves. They're at the end of the line and, I might as well come and see you because, now I can't sleep. And then changes do happen, which is always, it's such a wonderful experience to have with people. I've got one question for you. Have you got a couple more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. I would love to know, there's so many things that I would love for us to touch on about upper quadrant, but one thing that we see a lot of in the Pilates industry is frozen shoulder. Could you just touch on it? How do you touch on frozen shoulder? Could you give us some of your insight into frozen shoulder?
I think it's something that is probably significantly over-diagnosed, and that's like a true adhesive capsulitis is, where that capsule has become properly jammed down, and there can be no, there's obviously loads of research out there, but it can just happen. I think that in the presence of a longer-term dysfunctional upper quadrant, you're increasing the chances that you will develop a frozen shoulder. But I think actually there's the tests for it for a start. If in terms of external rotation, if the patient just gets to neutral and they cannot externally rotate whatsoever, there's just a really solid block, and then that's a strong indicator of a frozen shoulder. And that being the case, you are then on a journey. As in it is going to take time for that to that disease process to resolve and the inflammation to settle down. And while some of certainly the management here in the UK is to say, well, sorry, just go away and live with it and it'll get better in 18 months to 2 years. What I've seen is that we are able to accelerate that process by giving it the right regular input at the right times. So, when it's really angry, you've got to be backing off a bit more. But once it starts to settle down, you can, and you through that inflammatory stage, you can actually accelerate the progress through the cold phase. But I think also just coming back to, so that's for like the true frozen shoulder. But I think for every true frozen shoulder, there's probably about 2 or 3 that present as frozen shoulders or are called frozen shoulders, but actually are more likely to be C5-6 referral radiculopathy type situations. And so before you go and you kind of put the stamp of this is a true frozen shoulder on it, you want to see how is that trunk functioning? What is the neurodynamics like? What is the overall postural position and postural mechanics like, because that can be easily influenced and effectively influenced. So it is, if it's a true frozen shoulder, then it is a journey. And I do believe that you can accelerate that process, that it isn't necessarily going to be the full 18 months, but with the right consistent inputs, you can speed up the cold recovery phase a lot quicker than is perhaps thought to be the case. But shoulder pain presents in many and varied ways, but it is about coming back to that whole sort of quadrant view and saying, well, in what context is this glenohumeral joint operating? What are the forces around it, and what position is it being asked to work in? And so if we can optimize all of that by improving our thoracic balance, by improving head neck function, and then improving neurodynamics, seeing what's going on through the scalenes, what's going on through the upper ribs. Because this is another big thing that I've seen over the years, is that I don't think I've ever seen a pure frozen shoulder without a number of these other issues going on, and that being stiffening of the upper thorax. So not just the thoracic spine or mid-thoracic spine, but the stiffening of the thorax, as in the first 2 or 3 ribs getting really stiff and stuck and jammed up because of the longer-term irritation of the lower C-spine and the consequential or commensurate process of the shortening and tightening of the anterior scalenes, which then elevate the ribs, which then reduce your neurodynamics, which then impedes the effective function and the neural drive from C5, 6 down into the rotator cuff, and therefore you end up with dysfunctional or a dysynchronous rotator cuff mechanism, which then predisposes you towards impingement, and you've already had that underlying predisposition towards it because of the shortening and tightening of the pecs and pec minor. And so all these things then just cause irritation, pain, and you're just feeding you're casting votes for pain and irritation and dysfunction, and then you end up with these things. Whereas if we can say, well, okay, that process might be going on within the shoulder capsule itself, but what about all the other stuff that we can influence? So hopefully that's info.
Yeah, it's the bigger picture. Yeah, I always feel like whenever I see people who, and I don't diagnose anything, I'm a Pilates teacher, but I work with people with injuries. So they come and, I've got frozen shoulder. When I look at the other shoulder, it often, like the scapulohumeral rhythm is often very poor. So then I think in my mind, well, potentially that was happening to this shoulder,
For sure.
And over time of that, that whole rhythm being poor, then you've ended up with, this tightening all over the place, to try and compensate. But I don't know for sure.
But on that, and absolutely, absolutely, I think that is a big thing. But the whole, my belief is that the dysfunctional scapulohumeral rhythm is actually going to be driven by something else underlying it. And this is kind of a wood for the trees thing, is that we keep thinking about, well, we got to train the scapular setting, we got to do all this, but actually not recognizing that there's an overloaded C5, 6, for example, which is then reducing the neurodynamics. And so your scapular humeral mechanics and movement is all about creating a protective pattern for an underlying neural irritation. And so until that underlying neural irritation is addressed, you're not going to change the mechanics. And if you do manage to change the mechanics, it's going to be a painful experience because there's that underlying irritation. So it's because it always frustrated me. I was like, how do you... So change the scapulohumeral rhythm. I'm like, okay, but that doesn't really seem to work. So why? What's hiding underneath that's driving it? And to me, like, neurodynamics is kind of the top of the tree. Everything is to a certain extent is subservient to neurodynamic function, but neurodynamic function is then dependent on musculoskeletal function. So it's this constant thing of going round and round, like we were saying at the outset. It's about zooming in, zooming out, zooming in, zooming out, which is the great fun and great challenge of solving these complex problems. So.
Yeah, sure. And so when you say, the cervical is overloaded, as in like, the head forward kind of syndrome, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, for sure. Because it's about
when it comes to the shoulder issue.
Yeah, for sure. So I talk about compensatory capacity versus compensatory demand. And so the neck's ability to compensate for what's being put on it, and then how much demand there is for that. And while your capacity is greater than your demand, you have no symptoms. But the moment your demand increase is above your capacity, you then develop symptoms, be they neck pain, shoulder pain, etc., etc. So the neck is pretty much for the vast majority of us is always compensating by going into that extension. And so the trunk is flexed. Then we've got these 12 thoracic vertebrae that are flexed forwards, and then we've only got 7 little thoracic vertebrae that have to make up for that to keep the eyes facing forwards. And so the the whole C-spine really spends most of its life in extension. And this is beyond its normal kyphotic posture. It's extended beyond that. And so what that's then doing is the further you go into extension, the more it's closing down on the facet joints, the more it's closing down on the size of the intervertebral foramen where the nerve is coming out. And the important thing to remember is that the gap, because the nerves of the lower neck into the brachial plexus are supplying sensation and function to the hand, they're relatively thick nerves because there's lots of nerve fibers that are running through them. So you've got a reasonably large nerve going through a reasonably small space. So in the lumbar spine, you've got much bigger intervertebral foramina and smaller nerves. But in the neck, you've got a much smaller gap tolerance to it. So when you're then going into extension and you're closing down on that intervertebral foramen, you're getting really close to starting to irritate down on that nerve. And when you've then got loading of those sensitive structures and you get the strain, which leads to inflammation and those inflammatory exudates, etc., that then irritates the nerve, that's then going to result in that primary neurogenic inflammation, which is then going to just start to, I suppose the best word is to corrupt or downgrade the neural path, the neural drive through there. And therefore you then end up with this disruption of what should be this beautifully synchronous rotator cuff function. And once you then lose that, because the cuff is all about maintaining the head of the humerus in the glenoid at its point of moment of instantaneous rotation, etc. And so as soon as that starts to go and the head of the humerus starts to wander around a little bit more, then you're going to start getting that impingement and all the rest of it. But all of that is then, and this is the interesting thing, is that the imbalanced trunk mechanics causes the overload of the lower C-spine, but it's also resulting in the imbalance of the shoulder girdle and scapula. So you've got 2 potential causes of shoulder irritation that are feeding up and then feeding back down into each other. And then that becomes this whole milieu of issues that need to be resolved. But again, you go back down to the trunk, normalize the trunk mechanics, unload the C-spine, balance the forces around the shoulder, and strain just comes out of the system. And it all then starts to calm back down again and can get into a position where it can start to function more optimally. So, sorry, that's another tangent.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, because I suppose, and then, quite often what we see as far as a trunk, is, maybe like the pelvis is really pushing forwards or really pulling back, or, and then that's affecting the weight, the load through the feet when people are standing. And, it's that whole body effect, because the body's trying to find that optimal balance all the time, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah, in the environment of these internal, like I talk about the myofascial straitjacket, these forces that we've got that are keeping us off kilter because we spend so much time there. We've told our system we want to sit in front of a desk, hands on a keyboard, or head hanging over a phone. We're telling that's what we want hour after hour after hour. So we get optimized for doing that, but that means we're completely unoptimized for so many other essential movements of our day. So.
Yeah, we're designed to move. There's no doubt about it. Now, one last question. I know that you do some lecturing around the place. Do you have any like online components where people could look you up and do any workshops or find information from you?
We're building that. This is something that, I've spent 20 years kind of beavering away doing my thing, trying to get better at what I'm doing. And just over the last few years, or last couple of years, since I've developed the wedge and I wanted to take it to a wider world, I've then sort of seen that actually this is a message that really needs to get out there. So I'm kind of a little bit lagging behind in terms of the online content and all, but yeah, we are building that, and I've set up my profile, Insta profile of the .neck.physio, and so yeah, I just hope I've got a message that people want to hear and that I have value to add. And
I think you do. Yeah, I know you do, which is why I invited you on the show, just because I think I found you on Instagram after I'd met Jeannie DeBon and she recommended you, and then I watched you. I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what our community needs. So for those of you looking for more information on Michael or on the Optineck Balance Wedge, all of the notes are in the show notes, but it's a very simple website, optineck.com, OPTINECK.com. Michael O'Reilly, the Neck Physio. You'll find him on Instagram as well. Thank you so much for joining me, Michael. This has been really valuable information, and we could probably speak for another hour, but it's the end of my day, the start of your day. I'm sure that we've both got plenty of things that we need to be doing. So thank you, everybody, for joining me on the Pilates Lounge. My name's Katie Crane, the Pilates professional, and we'll see you next week for another episode. Thank you, Michael, so much for coming.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity.